Hi there. If you're watching this is the session, The Color of Drinking, Alcohol as a Social Justice Issue. Hi, I'm Reonda Washington, and I'm a substance abuse prevention specialist at the University of Wisconsin Madison. And this session is about a study that we have conducted on our campus. So we're going to get ready to hop into everything, but I at least wanted to say hi, and so you can see the face of the person who will be speaking with you. So when I normally do this presentation, there is always a booklet that goes along with it and that I will be pulling from and mentioning in this session. I've also pulled out some of the pages of things that I will be mentioning. But here's a link to the booklet that accompanies this session and will be in part of the things that I will be talking about. So an outline of sort of some of the things we're going to talk about, so we know what we're doing, is I'm going to talk a little bit about my university, UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin Madison, and its demographics, our alcohol climate and culture, our racial climate and culture. I will then dive into a little bit of theory with the multi-contextual model for diverse learning environments. I'll then talk about how we got to the survey and why we did the survey from a lot of student input and results, and then the survey results, and then sort of campus and student responses to the survey, the results, and then just the impact of the whole survey on our campus. While we're going through these slides, some things I want you to think about is how might these things apply to your campus environments? What things are similar? What things are different? What pieces of information do you already have, or who holds those pieces of information? And for the context of when I talk about social justice, I like to use this definition by Bell, which what I like about this definition is it says that social justice is a process and a goal, and that it requires action. So some things to think about as we go through all of this information. All right, starting a little bit about the university at which I work. I currently work at the University of Wisconsin Madison, which is a predominantly white institution. As you can see by our fall demographics, it is about 66% white. And we have a wealthy student population. Our median family income, or the average family income, is $154,600. We have only 53% of students who apply for FAFSA. When you look at some of our demographics, again, we are very white, and there isn't that many diverse students. One of the cultural things that's interesting about our campus is our campus is built on a Native American burial ground. And as you see in the demographics, there isn't a number for our Indigenous students. Currently, they are about 0.9% of our population, so that roughly equals 115 students. We are about half and half male. This year, we came really close to being a little bit closer to the 50-50 in-state of out-of-state. And most of our first-year students do live on our campus, but we are not a residential campus. We are a D1 research institution. We are considered urban because the campus is embedded in the city and the whole campus isn't part of the city. So again, things to think about when you're thinking about demographics of your own institutions or community organizations, for those of you that are listening. So thinking about our alcohol context. So Wisconsin is the #2 binge drinking state for all 18 to 44-year-olds. And I say 18 to 44-year-olds because everyone likes to assume that we're just talking about the college population. It is sort of a bigger culture thing, and sort of the things you think about when you think of Wisconsin: beer, cheese, brats, and the Packers. Again, we were #2. Sometimes we're #1, depending on the year in which it is, and the #1 spot is only ahead of us by 0.505 tenths of a point, and that would be North Dakota. So then also when we talk about some other things in our alcohol culture, is alcohol is really cheap in Wisconsin. We have some of the lowest alcohol taxes in the nation. Our beer tax, for example, has not changed since 1969. And it's 0.04 cents. And it is everywhere for students and for anyone else to enjoy in our campus. It's readily and accessible and available. And then we have some odd laws in Wisconsin, and they're more about protecting the business because we have a tavern league than protecting the health and well-being. So in the state of Wisconsin, there is not a state level bureau that regulates alcohol. Alcohol is regulated by municipality. So each municipality can have its own rules about alcohol. All the bars, taverns only have to report once a year to the Wisconsin Board of Revenue about them being a business. So some of the interesting laws that we have on our books, for example, operating while intoxicated, which might be a DUI in your state, is not a felony. The first one is a misdemeanor, and people can have up to 5 before their license is pulled. We also have the parent law, which becomes really interesting during tailgate season. It is written in the Wisconsin books that taverns can serve that anyone who is with their parent, guardian, step-parent, grandparent can purchase alcohol as well as drink it. And I know most states have a rule of you can drink with your parents in the privacy of your own home. This law takes it outside, and so the taverns that allow it, students or parents or children can order alcohol while out and drink it in public. Most of the taverns adhere to this. A lot of the commercials do not, but it's up to the discretion of the tavern. We also have no sober server, and there is no public intox law either here. So that's a little bit about some of the laws in our state and what they can look like for enforcement. The other big thing for us is alcohol outlet density. In this chart that you are looking at, the graph with the red dots are bars, the yellow dots are grocery stores. And you can sort of see in that area that looks like Wisconsin, there is a high concentration of red dots. And the picture beside it is the state of Wisconsin and looking at how many dots there are for those areas. And so for those of you that are wondering, Wisconsin is up here. And then our state, this is the high concentration of alcohol. And so right here, where Madison would be, that you see there's a high concentration, but that little hole of no dots is actually a lake. The city of Madison is on an isthmus, and so the lake cannot have bars on it, even though people have possibly tried. So looking at our alcohol context, so when we look at the university, 50% of our students drink at high risk, according to the American College Health Association. The national average of high risk drinking, when we compare it to this year, is 36%. And some of you are probably wondering, well, what about those other Wisconsin schools? The other Wisconsin schools participated in ACHA this year, and the year that I'm showing the data, and their average high risk drinking rate was 35%. So we have a higher rate of students drinking. And we also know from our alcohol EDU data, which I'll share a little bit later, we attract students coming in our door drinking more at high risk. So then we also go back to alcohol outlet density. There are 376 establishments that sell and serve alcohol within the 3-mile radius of our campus. So we have 376 establishments where students can buy alcohol that are not the places on campus. And then the average BAC, which is what PBT basically stands for, of a student who is transferred to detox is 0.222. For those of you that are wondering what that means, 0.08 is the legal limit to drink and drive in most states. 0.22 is almost 3 times that. In the state of Wisconsin, and specifically Dane County, which is where the university is located, there is a detox facility that is run by the state. And so if students are too intoxicated or incapacitated, basically, by our police measures, they will be taken to the detox facility. The university doesn't run it. If they are closer to death, they will be transferred to a hospital. And our detox facility is open to anyone in the public. And so students might be spending the night there as well. So some things that are different. When we look at the rate of high-risk drinking, it is not all our first-year students. What we see in our environment is, for our undergraduate population mainly, their first year is their lowest year of high-risk drinking, and the longer they stay in our environment, the more likely they are to high-risk drink all the way up until their senior year, and it drops off if they're here for 5th year. Okay, switching gears to campus climate, specifically talking about racial climate. We, like a lot of schools, have had an increase in hate and bias incidents and racial incidents. So I'm going to go a little bit about history of some of the things that have happened. So around 2014 is when we started seeing a surge, like all campuses, because of Trayvon Martin. And so we started having students protest, like Black Lives Matter, and students trying to get their voices heard. On our campus in 2015, we had the death of a biracial young man in the community, and that would be Tony Robinson. He was shot by a white police officer. And so this increased rage among students and the community and unrest. And so we started seeing an increase in protesting and the demand for equal rights and treatment across the board within Madison. Then we had spring of 2016, where we had a lot of campus racial incidences in that spring semester. There were 55 that were reported hate and bias incidents that happened in our campus. And so a lot of that was alcohol related, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a little bit. One of the big things that got a lot of attention was that an African-American young man was arrested in his African-American studies course for tagging different messages across campus. And that sort of was when the fever pitch of things had happened. Then we had the noose incident at football season where someone wore an Obama mask. This is right before the election of 2016. And it was and put a noose around the Obama mask neck with our school colors. And that caused a lot of controversy and caused more protest. That brings us to further along in 2017, one of our students had a clothing line that was considered controversial and would put things like all white people are racist on his clothing line and accidentally uploaded it to our university box system, which got national media attention and the ear of one of our congressmen. So we've had a lot of tensions on our campus. Then going to this past fall, we've still had lots of things that have happened in all between this. And one of the things was when we switched over to Indigenous Peoples Day. Every year now that I've been on campus and since we've switched to Indigenous Peoples Day, there has always been some portion of campus, and again, we're on an Indigenous burial ground, that becomes damaged by the residence hall that is named after Indigenous people and that is dedicated to a lot of our 7 nations. There has been desecration of rocks, there's been torn signs, there have been messages all over campus. So going back to this past fall, which is where a lot of the other images were taken, we had increased racial incidents starting in the fall. 2 environmentalists decided to protest the environment by standing outside of our humanities building and putting a noose around the tree and taunting students with that. The big incident for us this fall that caused the most controversy was actually our homecoming video, which this is a still from, where students were recorded. The homecoming video was about diversity. Student of color groups recorded, and they recorded pieces for this video. But when the video was published and touted as diverse, there was not a person of color in it. That caused a lot of outrage and anger from our students. And so they retaliated and protested again. And so one group went around putting signs on campus. And so one of them was UW's is for white only students, and that caused a lot of harm to a lot of people, even though this was done by students of color. Then students protested more, and the Student Inclusion Committee wrote a Bill of Rights and demanded things when it comes to racial protections for students. And then even in the time of COVID, we've had some incidents that have happened this spring, even though we've been viral for a lot of it. Um, as you can see in this last picture, on right outside our university bookstore, people have been chalking things about coronavirus and blaming international students specifically, or international Chinese students. And there have been a lot of incidents tied to that, as well as some Zoom bombing. So overall, to say, racial climate on our campus has been growing and has become hostile, and students of color sort of feel like they don't have rights or are getting trampled on at the expense of white supremacy. The other thing that I like to talk about here is the real UW, and this happened in 2016 spring. Remember that spring I said that we had 55 incidents? And sort of what happened here, this hashtag, and there are now new hashtags, was where students of color were starting to report things that were happening to them, but then some white students also would report things and sort of showing the racial war. And you can see some things here. One of the big things that drew ear and is pictured is that some student activists turned our mascot Bucky into KKK Bucky, which that didn't go over well. Students reported a lot of hostile things that happened to them, or how it felt like the university was trying to silence or cover up some of their pain or their harm. So then the other thing were the tweets. And so what I did with my students this semester is we analyzed all the tweets, the yik yaks, the Facebook posts to look at the content, because no one seemed to be looking at the content of what these tweets were looking at. And here's some examples of some of these tweets. And what we found was that 1 out of every 5 things that a student reported, alcohol was involved as the aggressor. The other thing that showed was throughout, remember I said there were 55 events, there were about 6 events where alcohol was used as the catalyst or the aggressor. So the big event that started the downward spiral of a lot of events was roommates in a war, when drunk, started putting swastikas outside of the other roommates' apartment or housing. Then we also had with the Native American Healing Circle, because Native American women have the highest rates of victimization. That was done at Dejope, which is our Indigenous residence hall, and like a lot of lands are there for Native American ceremony. Some drunk young men started mocking the elder who was performing the ceremony and caused a lot of harm. Then the big event for us was when a young man who was drunk spit on an African American young woman and called her poor and uneducated. That caused a lot of harm. But we have, within our racial culture, and tying it back to that alcohol piece, have had a lot of racist events where alcohol has been fuel for the catalyst for some of the harms that have come after it. So giving a little bit of theory and switching gears, and then I'm going to take a break and have you process some things. So this is a model for multicultural contextual model for diverse learning environments. Why I always like to show this here is it looks at what are the things you have to have for a climate for diversity. And it sort of looks like the ecological model, but it's looking at like what skills and what sets and what things do you need in your environment. And like on the climate for diversity piece, the things that are overlapping with the curricular and the co-curricular things are historical, organizational, compositional, psychological, and behavioral factors. I want to focus on 2 of those, but we'll start with like the physically present. So it's the foundational outcome for which everything, so students have to be recruited, enrolled in the university in a major in course X. So once the physically present is met, which is what we normally think about when we're thinking about the university or any school, is you got to recruit students, you got to get them here. But looking at the social, psychological presence and the relational presence, so feeling like they matter and that they belong in our environment, they're crucial factors which undergird and influence most of the desired student outcomes. And so as we're going through the survey data, when we get to the other pieces, here are some things to think about. Do students feel like they matter? Do they feel like they belong? And how is that getting turned up on its head? So taking a break right now. Some questions I always have people think through, and you can write these down or think how you would answer these yourselves. Thinking about everything I just showed you, which I know is a lot, what are your initial thoughts? How might the dynamics of alcohol culture play on your campus? What does the racial climate look like? Do you have a better percentage or a higher percentage of white and non-white students at your universities or your community spaces? What are the top health issues on your campus? So on our campus, and we know they're the top 4. There are other things that underlie and go with that, and they can change whatever direction they are. So mental health, alcohol climate, racial climate, and sexual assault are our top 4 health issues, and sort of underlay with everything. And then thinking about what data you have on your campuses. Could you tell me the story of your alcohol climate like I have with data that we have? Do you have other data sources that you're not utilizing or looking at, like police data or sanctions data? And how does that interweave to some of the narratives of what you're doing on your campus or how you're supporting student life in your communities, your campuses? And so thinking about those things, because sometimes people don't know they have data that might be telling them or pointing them to things or an indication. So moving on. So I always talk about the road to the survey. I never, like I said, set out to intend to be like, oh, we need to do this survey. That was never my intent when we started, but because I listened to students and students gave me feedback, this is how we got here. So again, as I've mentioned, here's a link to the booklet that I will be referencing in this next section if you want to grab it while we're talking, so that when I reference some things, you'll know what I'm talking about. So all of this started because of our alcohol EDU data from 2013. 2013 was my first year at the University of Wisconsin Madison, and I was brought in to run alcohol EDU. I tend to be a lot of a data-minded person, so when we got our data back in spring, I started like deconstructing some of the groups. And what we found was that students of color were non-drinkers at double the rate of their white peers, and that our students of color were high-risk drinkers at about half or less of the rate of our white students. And so what I did when we got our alcohol EDU results was I did an alcohol EDU data tour across campus. And the first one of the last places on the tour that semester I went was our Associated Students of Madison, ASM, which is our student government. And because of SEG fees, they approve SEG fees. They technically are the funders of my position and multiple positions on campus. So I was in a meeting and I shared alcohol EDU data, and specifically some of that data. And the chair of coordinating council, Mila was her name, and she was an African-American young lady, asked me a question that I couldn't answer. The question she asked me was, well, Ms. Washington, while all this data is great, you've talked a lot about the negative consequences of drinkers, but what about the negative consequences to drinkers due to others? Specifically thinking about discrimination and harassment, because I hear that a lot from our students on our campus. And so I told Mila at the time, I didn't know, but I'll look into it. And so when we started this process, I thought, maybe this will just be an extra question I add on alcohol EDU. So what I did was we have students that work over the summer, and I tried to get them to look in the research and do literature reviews of, hey, have you seen any information about one student of color drinking? Or have you seen anything about secondhand impacts, specifically discrimination and harassment of people of color by drinkers? And we didn't find that much, or a lot of the research would say students of color drink less, so we're not paying attention. So then what happened was fall 2014, I hired a grad student, her name was Melissa. And we decided we wanted to do focus groups with different groups of students of color and see what we need to ask or see what we're trying to look for to have a better grasp of the situation. And we started with the machistas, which were a Latinx subgroup of students. And we started doing focus groups and listening to them. And their feedback to us was, we ain't got no time for no focus groups. And We were like, okay. And we're like, what do you have time for? They're like, we'll do a survey. To which our response was, are you going to check your email? And they responded that yes, they would check their email if the survey was, 10 minutes or less. So we started building a survey after that based on their feedback. And so Color of Drinking 1 was done in spring of 2015. Part of why I'm not showing the results for Color of Drinking 1 is because IRB certified it as not research. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're a Research 1 institution, so it took a little bit more coaxing. But with Color of Drinking 1, we surveyed only undergraduate students of color. And also from the beginning, this ended up going 2 weeks after the shooting in the community that I mentioned at the beginning. So it was really interesting to get the feedback. So we got that information. Students did some stuff that I'll talk about later with that information. So then we're like, all right, we've got to do this again. And we wanted to go through IRB. So we did the painstaking process of developing it and going through IRB. And when we went through IRB the second time, we did a census of all undergraduate students of color, which was 4736, and a sample of white undergraduate students. Because the magic of Color of Drinking 1 was that it elevated students of color narrative and they weren't in deference to white students. Now, as you can see, our response rate with students of color, we got about 25%, and with white students, we got about a 17% response rate based on what our calculations based off response rates to Color of Drinking 1. So we're going to start into some of the information of what we found. I always ask this question first and foremost, and this is on page 7, 18, and 19 in your booklet. But I asked all students, describe the alcohol culture at UW-Madison, and without me putting any caveats on it, and seeing how they would answer these questions. For white students, and here's the page, one of the pages from the booklet that shows how they say that, but for students of color, the three themes that they had was the alcohol culture is prevalent, the alcohol culture is how UW-Madison students socialize, the pressure to participate in the drinking culture is high. And then for our white students, they had the same one that matched as number 1. The alcohol culture is how UW-Madison students socialize. The UW-Madison alcohol culture encourages drinking heavily, and participation in the alcohol culture is dependent of who you socialize with. And so this always starts the frames of how I view how students answered their question, because we asked them how they viewed the alcohol culture at UW-Madison, and was it a good or bad thing for them? For students of color, it was overwhelmingly a negative thing for them. For our white students, depending on which ones you asked, but a lot of the drinkers felt that it was a positive thing for them. But they both agreed that alcohol culture is how UW-Madison students socialize. I want you to hold on to that one as we go to different pieces. So to make this more easy to take away, I have broken down the main takeaways, and there are 5 from the Color of Drinking data, and I will be sharing other pieces. So the first one is alcohol use by the majority is a protective factor for academic and social success. This is always a hard one for people to understand, but in our environment, alcohol is a protective factor for our majority students, and let me show you a little bit. So this is on page 8 in your book. We did drinker types by groups in Color of Drinking, and it sort of mirrored what we had been seeing in multiple campus things, where white students were more likely to be high-risk drinkers, sometimes at double the rate of our students of color, and then students of color were more likely to drink at low risk or just not drink at all at higher rates than their white counterparts. So on page 10, you'll see this, we incorporated the Diner Flourishing scale. And the flourishing scale is not connected to being a college student, it's not connected to alcohol. It's just asking about positive well-being in a student. And some of the measures are, I lead a purposeful life. My social relationships are supportive. I'm interested in my daily activities. I actively contribute to the well-being of others. I am competent in the activities that are important to me. I have a good life. I'm optimistic about my future, and people respect me. So what you're seeing are the students who had some of the higher scores within the flourishing scale and are actively flourishing. But what you see is with students of color, alcohol isn't tied to flourishing. They flourish at various rates, but alcohol isn't correlated with them flourishing. However, with white students, you see that the high-risk drinkers have the highest amount of flourishing scores compared to drinkers have higher scores than that compared to non-drinkers. And this follows a trend that we see in other surveys that we have done. So we see this in our Healthy Mind survey. We've seen this in our alcohol use survey when we added the diner scale as part of the story. And what we sort of saw with the alcohol edu numbers is alcohol is not correlated with flourishing before students come to campus. Within the first 2 months of being in their environment, regardless of identity, alcohol is correlated with flourishing. But then when they get to winter, which is where color of drinking was, it stops impacting students, it stops being correlated with flourishing for students of color, whether they drink or don't drink, and is higher correlated with high-risk drinking for our white students or drinking in general. So the other thing I always talk about here is GPA. So this was also taken from our Healthy Mind study. And what you're looking at is the grades distributed by no alcohol use, any alcohol use, or diagnosed with a substance abuse order. And this follows our outline of our campus grade distribution. What I like to point out here is that basically for our drinkers or non-drinkers, there's not really a difference in grades. And what we know from a lot of literature is that the more you drink, the worse your grades are. But in our environment, that is not the case. So what does this look like when we're talking about our campus grades and alcohol trends, and where have we seen this? In our 2017 and our 2019, we had our Dean of Students office look at the average GPA of adjudicated students for alcohol use, and their average GPA was 3.8. Our Greek women, who are our highest risk female group drinkers at about a 72% high risk drinking, they consistently have higher GPAs than the campus average. Is something that they actually recruit on, specifically our Pan-Hellenic chapters. And then our high-risk residence halls, which are 2 towers, consistently have higher GPAs than the rest of the 19 residence halls in our halls, including some of those with learning communities. So basically, drinkers, if they are majority, are thriving and surviving in our environment, and they're not seeing some of the negative outcomes that the research tells us we will see with our drinkers in our environment. So, color of drinking takeaway number 2. Safety is a concern among all students, but students of color safety is impacted more disproportionately. So on page 10, you will find this question in your booklets. We asked this in color of drinking 1, as well as color of drinking 2. And again, color of drinking 1 focused on just students of color, so there was not a white student group. But do you avoid specific areas on or off campus due to concerns about the alcohol use of others? So what we see is about 50% of students of color said, yeah, I do avoid places, versus about 40% of white students. When we look at the breakdown by race, African-American students or Black students had the highest rates of avoiding specific areas, followed secondly by multiracial students. What was interesting is when we asked students where they avoided, there really wasn't that much of a difference by race. So fraternity and sorority housing, a lot of them, specifically IFC and Pan-Hellenic chapters, also live on Langdon Street. They got pulled out specifically because of feedback from our first survey, but then the second and the third and fourth places are basically the same for both groups: house parties and State Street and the bars. So here's a map of the edge of our campus. And what I'm going to show you is Langdon Street runs into campus, and our Memorial Union is right on Langdon Street. Right beside it is the red gym, even though this map doesn't show it. But Langdon Street runs into the residential area, which is where our fraternity and sorority houses are. And then State Street connects campus and the Capitol together. What you see in the middle of that is the Memorial Library, which is the only 24/7 library. And then right on the corner across the street from Memorial Library is a bar. And what we talk about with both groups of students is if they were studying at the library and had to leave or go home on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday night, where are they going to have to cross and who are they going to have to run into on their way home? If they're doing something at Memorial Union, or if they're at the Red Gym, what might happen on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday night when there are multiple people in our areas that will be on these streets? Because campus doesn't just start and end on Lake Street. And also in this area over here are more bars, or the big State Street bars that you hear about on the news are a high concentration. And in this square are 200 plus bars and liquor stores in this adjacent square. And there has been an increase of crime in that square just over time as well. So students aren't feeling safe in those areas that are campus adjacent and that connect campus to the city, basically. Moving on to our next section, which is page 12. This is on pages 12 and 20. Has alcohol use impacted your overall health, physical, mental, overall well-being in the time you have attended UW-Madison? What you can see is that about 30% of students of color and about 35% of white students said yes or unsure. But what was interesting is the different places this goes. So this is sort of the breakdown, and again, it is on that page, pages 12 and 20 that I mentioned before. So what we saw with students of color is students of color talked more about impacts to mental health and concern for safety, versus white students were more likely to talk about impacts to their physical health, like a lot of gained weights, or they broke or tore something, or then an impact to their social life, which was completely different. And as you can see with some of the examples, and again on pages 12 and 20 in your booklet, students of color can tell you in greater detail the impact it's having to their lives. So when we also talk about mental health on our campus, I'm going to show you some of the rates of things that we've known is happening on our campus from our Healthy Minds data. So 2016 and 19 is when we've done our Healthy Minds data. What you see is that in 2019, the average depression was 31%. Students of color overall, with the exception of one group, had higher rates. We also know that the N is small for our American Indian and Alaskan and Native, but you can see they have more or higher rates of depression than their white peers, and then it has increased, like all places, since 2016. Then we also look at anxiety, which was 27, and again, for the most part, students of color, with the exception of two groups, have higher rates. All three groups have higher rates than the white student population, but it's still something that is plaguing the community. And then finally, talking a little bit about suicidal ideation, that's 11%, but what was interesting is that students of color were more likely to endorse the idea of suicidal ideation as being an acceptable option in our environment. While they didn't necessarily experience it, they were like, no, that's an okay thought to have, especially with being in this environment. So the other thing I always like to talk about, because students of color talked about safety, when we look at sexual assault, we have participated in the Association of American Universities, AAU, the AAU study for the past 2 years. And what we see is women of color have higher rates of victimization than their white counterparts, with the exception of Asian American women, or Asian women in general. But again, going to that safety, women of color have higher rates of experiencing victimization in our environment. And then when we look at alcohol-facilitated sexual assault specifically, we are at 76% of our assaults based on the survey involved alcohol, and that's higher than the national average. The other thing I talk about is sort of our environment, and remember how we talked about, where students talked about alcohol is how you were social. Majority of victims were ingesting alcohol voluntarily that night of perpetration, and this is not to victim blame, but to sort of think about the social aspects that alcohol brings, and then also how perpetrators might prey on that in multiple environments. Okay, moving on to the third takeaway. So alcohol use, specifically high-risk drinking, is tied to how UW-Madison students connect and belong. This one is a big one, and connecting and belonging, and remember we talked a little bit about mattering and belonging earlier, are very key. So on pages 13 and 20, you will find these quotes and things of that nature. But we asked the question, has your personal alcohol use or the alcohol use of others impacted your overall sense of belonging at UW-Madison? And regardless of race, about 46% of students said alcohol was tied to a sense of belonging. What's interesting is what they said. And what I often talk about here is the term badgers. Like most schools, students and most new universities like to tie the school mascot to our students' belonging. It's like, you're a badger, I went to East Carolina University, so I'm a pirate. Or, like it's often tied to the school mascot. But in our environment, what we find is that a lot of students don't like to be called a badger because of the connotation of a badger as being someone who drinks a lot. So they go from coming in and the chancellor at convocation calls them all badgers to, once they've gone longer here, not wanting to be associated with that. And a lot of it is students of color, but there are some white students that feel that way. But when we start looking at some of these themes for belonging, there are subtle differences, and I'll turn it to the next page to show you sort of what students said as I read some of these. But basically, for students of color, if you don't drink, you don't fit in at UW-Madison. Alcohol use by others makes me feel isolated, and alcohol use enhances racial issues. And with that, if you don't drink, you don't fit in at UW-Madison. One of the quotes from Color of Drinking One that always sticks out with me is turn up or transfer, drink or leave. And that's the message that students are getting. When we look at the white students who set the norm and are the bigger group, you see there is alcohol helps you fit and belong. If you don't drink, you don't belong, echoing that turn up or transfer feel. Alcohol helps you meet new people. Drinking alcohol helps me feel like I belong at UW-Madison, and alcohol helps you bond with people socially. So different circumstances of how alcohol is connected with belonging and students' experiences, but also setting up that norm and reinforcing that norm that you need to drink to belong in our environment. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you. And if you don't, you'll be isolated. And if you don't, if you have a different racial background, you're going to be picked on. So one of the things we've done with our new Healthy Minds data is we've been looking at belonging in alcohol. And so what we have found is alcohol use is highly correlated with belonging in our environment. And what you're seeing in that upper right quadrant is high sense of belonging. And if you notice, students who are in there, alcohol is impairing their daily life. They have high audit C scores. They have binge drank. They have used any alcohol period, or they have a moderate audit score. And that's the alcohol use disorders tool and screening, identification tool and screening. But then if you look in the lower left quadrant, low audit use and no alcohol use are there, as well as abuse in general is negatively correlated with belonging. But what we're seeing here, and what I'm focusing on for now, is that the alcohol use is tied to high belonging. The other thing we looked at was marginalization, or how do different groups show up for belonging in general in our environment. And what we have found out is that, so again, going over the context of how we're looking at belonging is, on the vertical axis, I have a group, community, or social circle at UW-Madison where I feel I belong, feel at home, known, connected to, and supported in my identity. And then on the horizontal axis is I see myself as part of the campus community. So we look at different groups by varying degrees of identities. And sort of what you'll notice is in that upper right-hand corner where a lot of the high-risk drinking or the drinking in general is, you have a lot of those dominant identities. And then in this lower left-hand corner, it's a lot of those marginalized identities. What we also show is if students have more than 2 marginalized identities, they have lower sense of belonging, and it stacks up the more marginalized identities they have. And for the purpose of gender, male is the dominant, and so female is the marginalized identity, but they had lower sense of belonging. So all of that ties in together with alcohol and racial climate coming together to work on students' low sense of belonging in our environment, at the very least. The other thing we look at is our campus climate survey, which asked students in 2016, how often do you feel like you belong? And as you can see as a baseline, tying it into other data sources, 50% of students of color felt like they belonged, and 75% of white students felt like they belonged. So there's already a difference in who feels like they belong on our campus. The campus climate survey also took it further and asked, how often do you feel safe, welcome, respected, or excluded? And you can see that students of color are less likely to feel safe, welcome, or respected than their white counterparts, and they're more likely to feel excluded. So the fourth takeaway from color drinking is racial climate and microaggressions impact student of color's well-being and retention the most. So one of the things that I have asked in both color drinkings, and I say it's an extreme, is I've asked about microaggressions. And here's the definition that I use for microaggressions. And based on how we are looking at this, we only asked students of color. We did not ask white students about if they had experienced microaggressions. And so on pages 15, 22, and 23 in your booklets, you'll see this question. And so in 2015, I asked it, have you experienced a microaggression at UW-Madison? 62% of students said yes. Yes, I asked it in 2017 when we did color drinking too, and the numbers stayed about the same. What was interesting with this version is, and how I asked the question different. So in color drinking 1, I asked only about, again, like after this, how many microaggressions have you experienced because of alcohol? And the updated version, I asked about all experiences students had with microaggressions. And so based on different races, you can see the breakdown of who experienced them more. And African-American students or Black students had the highest rates of experiencing microaggressions. And what's interesting is when we do varying analysis, if we start with race and then go to gender, Black women specifically have the highest rates of experiencing microaggressions in our environment. If we start with gender and then go to race, then it's actually Asian and Asian American women who experience the higher rates of microaggressions. So just a little bit of sample of some of the themes that came out, or the top themes that came out when we asked about all of the microaggressions that you have experienced. So there is harassment based on students' race, ethnicity, or assumed race or ethnicity, their classroom interactions, which to me, and when people ask me what was the most surprising, was just how much students talked about their classroom interactions, whether it be the professor, whether it be the TA, whether it be their classmates, and things they're experiencing in their classroom. And of course, alcohol-related microaggressions came up, or stereotypes about race, ethnicity, or assumed race or ethnicity were some of the top ones. And again, this is taken from the booklet on pages 15, 22, and 23. So again, students talked a lot about different kinds and then how alcohol plays into that. One of the classroom interaction quotes from Color Drinking 1 that has had a lot of traction with some of our faculty and staff is that a student talked about their TA or professor inviting them out to drink and how that made them feel uncomfortable. So again, different things students are reporting. So then on page 15, again, you will find, have you witnessed a microaggression or have you intervened? And we asked both groups. What's interesting here is, of course, students of color said they had witnessed more, but there is a higher percentage of white students than we would think. But then intervention for both groups of students is low. And so we don't know if that's they don't know how to intervene, they don't know if they should intervene. We don't even know if they have noticed the event. So it's something that we have been working on within our campus. And so again, saying what our campus climate survey had, have you experienced or witnessed hostile, harassing, or intimidating behavior? 35% of students of color and 28% of white students had. The other thing we asked, and this is on page 11, in color of drinking 2, that we didn't ask in color of drinking 1, was, have you considered leaving the university? And then we asked students why. So what we found is that students of color were 4.5 times more likely to consider leaving the university than their white counterparts. And the reasons were really interesting. Racial climate was number 1 for students of color, while academic reasons were number 1 for white students. Mental health was number 2 for both. But then what we always point out is if you give students the reason of alcohol, alcohol showed up in the top 6 for both groups. And so thinking about what that means. And then this mirrored sort of what you saw within the campus climate survey. They asked, have you seriously considered leaving UW-Madison? Students of color still had higher rates than white students. And the number 1 reason was campus climate, which was the same across everything. Finally, getting to the last takeaway. Allowances and exceptions are made academically to support drinkers and the alcohol culture. And so we broke up a question from color of drinking 1, which was just a write-in, and this is on page 17. Have you experienced the following? Having to find alternative space to study because of the alcohol culture, roommates being too loud, causing harm. When assigned group work or meetings, having to schedule them around the alcohol drinking holidays or the consumption of alcohol, because everyone is scheduled with, group work. And then my professors or TAs discuss, joke, make bad comments about alcohol in the classroom. So the last one with the professors and TAs is statistically significant, but it's sort of showing the experiences and allowances our environment makes for students who drink versus students who don't drink, or some of the things that students have to do to schedule around alcohol. We also asked, because we are an academic institution, have you experienced the following because of your own alcohol use in the last year? And students of color had lower rates of experiencing because they're less likely to drink, but being too hungover to attend class, choosing to drink instead of study, and performing poorly on an assignment were the ones that were statistically significant between groups. So I have just talked a lot and thrown a lot at you in the last little bit. I want to take a pause before moving on and thinking about what are your thoughts about this and what are things that are relevant to your campuses or community areas, or what would you want to take back or pieces that you might want to investigate more in your environments? All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the response and things after the survey, and we've done this survey twice, but mostly I'm going to refer to the responses to the 2017 one. So there were a lot of different responses, and sometimes it took a delay for certain responses, but one of the first groups who were like, we're going to do something about this, and straight up did, was our University of Wisconsin Police Department. PD are sometimes some of the best campus partners, and they were like, Reonda, you have brought this information to us twice, and students are saying they don't feel safe on Langdon Street. Langdon Street, because of jurisdictional reasons, RPD have to ask permission from the city because there is that divide. And so what they did was they asked for permission from the city for at least our first 45 days initiative, which happens during the first 6 weeks of course, to have more of a presence on Langdon Street and to help keep students safe. And they've had many varying success, but they've also now got a liaison officer on that street now who can have eyes and help mitigate circumstances, and they're able to step in. The Red Gym, which I also mentioned, was on Langdon Street. For the first time in a while, our university had an after hours alcohol-free event open to students. And the Red Gym After Hours had 2 events in fall of 2018 and spring of 2019, where they had events geared for students to meet each other without alcohol being present. And the first one was held during the first Friday after school started, so that students had the opportunity to meet and get connected to resources without alcohol playing a factor. And then this was also done the week after spring break, so that it could help students reconnect or get refocused or have some activities and fun. And it was like one of the first big all alcohol free events open to all students that wasn't just related to housing. Our union, as I've mentioned, I think a couple of times, does sell alcohol. So even though they are allowed to host events and they do host events, people can still carry their alcohol throughout. And so we don't consider events held at our union as alcohol free. University Housing, which I mentioned, has done a lot of alcohol-free events for their residents every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night, but they also changed some of their policies to address violators and help them see the environmental impact of their drinking. And so if they disrupted the environment, they have them do restorative justice and restitution to people on their floors if alcohol caused environmental impact. And then one of the other initial responses is the Center for Leadership and Involvement, CFLI, as we often call it, is host fraternity and sorority life. And fraternity and sorority life, before of this ask of moving their buses from loading in front of the Red Gym, what this meant at the time was that the Red Gym, as I've mentioned, is home to a lot of marginalized groups organization, the Gender Sexuality Campus Center, the Multicultural Student Campus Center, the International Student Service, Study Abroad are all in this building. And also is Fraternity and Sorority Life and the Center of Leadership and Involvement. And what would happen would be fraternity and sorority life members would load their buses for their events in front of the Red Gym. A lot of people pre-gaming and going into the Red Gym and causing harms to communities or causing problems. So the Center for Leadership Involvement asked that fraternity and sorority life not be allowed to load their buses in front of the Red Gym. They moved them down the street to an alcove right in front of the lake so that people could load their buses and not cause harm to other groups or people within the Red Gym. Some strategic campus responses. Color of drinking is listed in the Vice Chancellor Student Affairs strategic priorities. So one of the interesting changes that have happened in our environment is in fall 2019, we started becoming a student affairs unit. Before that, there were multiple units, but there wasn't actual student affairs. So student affairs has come back to our campus and has started up. And so as one of the priorities, listed in the Vice Chancellor Student Affairs priorities is addressing items that were found in color of drinking. Also, the VCSA Identity and Inclusion Unit is using color of drinking to structure activities and programs around connectedness and belonging. For this past fall, our VCSA communications team used color of drinking as the basis of how they communicated about alcohol to students for this fall semester. So then I keep mentioning fraternity and sorority life. They're using color of drinking as one of their guiding pieces for outcomes for a review. They had a review this past year in spring of 2019. And color of drinking came out as one of those things that need to be addressed with issues because students saying they don't feel safe in fraternity and sorority houses, specifically the chapter facilities on Langdon Street, came out. And so they've been working to address those issues. And so part of moving forward is the Langdon Street Coalition got formed, and they are actively working even now in the time of COVID of how are we making Langdon Street safe for not only fraternity and sorority members, but all students who don't live there. And so it's got fraternity and sorority life housing, people who own businesses, the union, the Red Gym representatives talking about how are we making Langdon Street more safe for everybody and what measures or things can we do and who in the community can we involve. And then our Student Involvement Coalition have used color of drinking in responses to the homecoming video and in their list of demands. So the pictures at the bottom of this was I mentioned the homecoming video was pretty substantial this fall, and students not feeling welcome. And so our Student Involvement Coalition actually told me that they paid homage to color of drinking with these imageries in one of the videos they put back in retaliation, or to cover the homecoming video, where, as you can see in the picture, you have students that are standing on Langdon Street, and there's a picture of Langdon Street. This home isn't safe after dark or after sunset, because this is how many students of color feel. And again, in their list of demands, and also in calling out how can the university help students, the Student Involvement Coalition had pieces of color of drinking and wanted to make sure that they were addressed, because color of drinking elevated student voices. So mainly how students have used color of drinking, and students have done a lot with color of drinking, and sometimes it surprises me some of the things that they do. So in spring 2016, after color of drinking won, student activists, after the spring, I told you 2016, we had a hard spring, they used color of drinking data to say, hey, you know, we're having troubles and we're having struggle, and they advocated for our Wisconsin programming. And our Wisconsin is now a required in-person hate bias training for all incoming first-year students, and they are required to do this. They normally do it with their hall or floor, and they're specialized ones for students of color, students with different identities, students with disabilities. But this is now a requirement at this point in time, but it started with students advocating from spring 2016 with color of drinking and making the university prioritize having some kind of in-person training. In the 2018-2019 school year, our multicultural student center staff utilized color of drinking too to help advocate for new cultural centers. We had before this a Black cultural center, and there is an Indigenous cultural center that's about to be torn down. But we've had those for times. But what the staff at the MSC did was they took this data and advocated that other student groups of color need their own spaces, and we're able to get, and we now have, an APITA space for our Asian students and a Latinx cultural center that we did not have prior to this. So color of drinking helped. It didn't do all of the work, but it helped them advocate for the space for individual groups to have their own space within the Red Gym and on campus so that they could feel safe. And then this past fall, we incorporated color of drinking into our Badger Step Up program. And Badger Step Up is required for a member of all registered student orgs and all first year Pan-Hellenic and IFC Greek students have to go through this training. This training talks about, as student leaders, how are you holding members in your groups responsible for alcohol use? Because 65% of all student org misconduct is alcohol related. And for fraternity and sorority life, that is 75%. And so we've incorporated more color of drinking of how are you holding members accountable for not causing harm, because if they choose to drink at events you're holding as a registered student org or as a fraternity and sorority coalition. So summarizing the color of drinking data. So alcohol use on our campus is correlated with academic and social success among our majority students. Alcohol is not a study enhancing drug, but students who are drinking are getting more of those social benefits that help them get access to resources. Students of color are have experienced more negative impacts and consequences than white students by not participating in the drinking culture, which impacts safety, mental health, considering to leave the university and sense of belonging. And high-risk drinking is how UW-Madison students connect and belong. Allowances are made both academically and socially to participate in our high-risk drinking. So sort of to end up, what have been like some of the big impacts of color of drinking? Like I said, when I started this process, I never thought we would be here. But what color of drinking has done is it's gotten attention from our campus administration, because it has elevated the voices of students of color and their narrative. For students of color, they feel that this helps tell their story and expose their realities of this campus. The survey brought alcohol into the conversation of campus climate. before color of drinking, administrators were not able to talk about alcohol in the campus climate context before. And so that's really interesting that we've built capacity, and it's amazing how many administrators quote things from color of drinking or say things for color of drinking, or in some of our high impact searches, color of drinking has ended up and shown up in weird places. And so sometimes it's really interesting for me as one of the people who has carried this to hear what people are talking about and how the context is. What this has also helped us do is do more work as a prevention unit with faculty and staff, because it's gotten them to think about, put prevention on their plates and thinking about how do we need to address prevention as well as mental health and some of the other issues that come in our environment, and how can we have, trauma informed practices as well as high impact practices that can help, acknowledge and mitigate some of the risk from the alcohol culture. And so that's really big. And our academic staff person in prevention, which we now have, does a lot of work with faculty and staff. And alcohol is one of those things we talk about, and color of drinking also plays, because it changed the conversation from, you should care about alcohol just because it matters, but with you're talking about alcohol in the classroom, it's actually alienating a lot of students that you might want to keep. It has laid the groundwork for a lot of intersectionality conversations. Even though my unit is technically set up as individualized, like I do alcohol work, we have someone who does mental health work, we have someone, as I mentioned, who does academic practices, and we have a violence prevention team. It has made us all have to work together, an intersection of issues, but it's also helped with our student affairs group of talking about all of the issues, especially of the big four issues: mental health, racial climate, alcohol, and sexual assault, and how they work together and where all the pieces. And it's also helped us pull resources or shift where resources go, instead of being like, oh, this is earmarked for alcohol, this is earmarked for sexual assault, this is earmarked for mental health. It's how are we working together to address these, specifically with sense of belonging being one of those big things that's in all of the issue areas for varying groups. And then the big thing, and I've touched on this a little bit, is that we've had significant shift in thinking about health equity and allocation of resources. So like most, places that talk about alcohol, we used to, and because of the paradigm shift, like focus on the high risk drinkers. What are the high risk drinkers doing? We had a high number of high risk drinkers, and like, what are we doing to mitigate the risk of high risk drinkers, and how are we doing that? And we put lots and lots of resources. But what color of drinking has done is gotten us to step back. And yes, we still have some things for high risk drinkers and if they get caught, but it's really shifted our approach to dealing with high risk drinking of, okay, the high risk drinkers, which sometimes it's hard to say, are fine. But what about the students who aren't high risk drinking? What are the impact the high risk drinkers are having on them? And how are we helping support non-drinkers, students in recovery, even our low risk drinkers who might be harmed by the choices of the high risk drinkers? And so that's been a game changer. And it's gotten our campus, but also us as a prevention unit, to have to think about things in a different way, and thinking more health equitably about how resources are managed and what things are we putting resources in and what messages are we telling students, and being very more intentional, whether it be from orientation to where students might end up on campus, and also working with our campus partners to build capacity around addressing the secondhand impacts of high risk drinking. And so even our campus has had that shift, which has been interesting. And we know that for a sense of belonging and connectedness, as I've mentioned before, alcohol is a facilitator in our environment. And as our students said earlier, alcohol is how you are social. So we've been working on how do we uncouple alcohol from sense of belonging. So I am at time. Thank you for listening to me talk about what we are. If you have questions, thoughts, or reactions, please feel free to email me at reonda.washington@wisc.edu. Thank you. Have a great day.